Excellent. Well, I just want to welcome everyone to our second seminar in this year's our second series. We're moving to hybrid with some people in the centre, as you can see in the boardroom there, and it's causing some lovely little feedback issues. But it's very exciting to have, at least in theory, a hybrid seminar now, and hopefully that's a sign of continual progress and opening up, which would be wonderful. So thank you all for being here. Just a few little housekeeping things at the beginning. We're going to have a panel of three poets and speakers, which will take about 45 minutes, and we'll have a 5-minute break leading us into the second half, when we'll have an open Q&A. During the poetry speakers themselves, could people please remain muted? And if you have any questions at the time, please put your questions in the chat, and I'll be keeping an eye on those so we can use those to bring people in the second half. In the second half, depending on how many people are there and when people want to speak, people can obviously come off mute and show themselves as well. Also, we have a transcriber, we've got live captioning, and if you would like to take advantage of that, then please click on it at the bottom of your screen. You should see a little button for transcript, and if you click show subtitle, it will show it along the bottom of the screen. And if you want the full transcript appearing in the chat, you click view full transcript, and you can do both of those things as well. Aside from that, I think that's all the housekeeping. And at the end, I'll give a little bit of a mention of the upcoming seminars as well. But I'm going to hand over to Laura now, who's chairing our session. So thank you, Laura.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Just before we start, I was just going to introduce myself because I think there are quite a few of you who don't know me. Can I just check everyone can hear me okay? Yeah, lovely, thank you. So I'm Laura Warner. I joined the centre a few weeks ago as a new PhD student here. I completed my MA in creative writing in Exeter in 2020. Today's seminar is particularly exciting for me because my PhD project, Uterine Poetics, brings together my personal passion for poetry and my belief in poetry as a vehicle for inspiring meaningful change, together with my lived experience of uterine-associated pain and illness in relation to a condition called endometriosis. My project's still very much in its infancy, so I've got lots to learn about this space where health research and poetry meet. But I do know that poetry has a lot to contribute to conversations and practices in health research that help us to enable or honour the voices of those with lived experience of the conditions that we study. So I'm very excited to introduce today's three speakers. We have poet Jenny Padgin. We have Fiona Hamilton, a poet and writer who specialises in creative writing for therapeutic purposes. And we have Dr. Ryan J. Petteway, a poet and assistant professor in the OHSU PSU School for Public Health. Each of our guest speakers will speak to us about their work, and then we will have time for questions after a short break. So first of all, I'm delighted to introduce Jenny. Born in High Wycombe, Jenny Padgin studied BA English at Oxford University and MA Creative Writing at the University of East Anglia. Her pamphlet Coldbeck, which tells the story of her postnatal psychosis, was published by Eyewear in 2017, shortlisted for the Dyslexia Pamphlet Competition and listed by the Poetry Book Society. She won the Cafe Writers Norfolk Prize in 2017 and the 2020 Alumno Norwich City Wall Commission, and was longlisted for the Rebecca Swift Foundation Women's Poetry Prize 2018 and the National Centre for Writing's A Room of One's Own residency. Her work has been published in Ink, Sweat and Tears, Wild Court and the Agenda Broadsheet, and is forthcoming with Smoke and Magma. Jenny lives with her husband and son in Norfolk, where she works for a charity. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you very much, Laura. And hi to everyone, and biggest thanks to the Welcome Centre and University of Exeter for inviting me and for asking important questions. As said, I'm going to be sharing some poems today. And when I had my son 8 years ago, I developed postnatal psychosis, stroke bipolar 1, with a postnatal onset, which was a new thing, because prior to that I'd had reasonable mental health and wasn't under any services. And I'm sure you'll all know this, but psychosis is a break from shared reality. I've recently finished my first collection of poetry, which is called In the Snow Globe, and it describes that feeling of being in a bell jar or living behind glass, in some way experiencing a different reality from everyone else. It felt when I was ill like dreaming with my eyes open, but even as I'm talking about this, I'm kind of conscious of stepping into metaphor or poetry, because that was such a helpful way to verbalize what happened. So I'll be reading about 6 poems. I'm going to start straight away with the one that was the most challenging for me, in the sense of making me feel vulnerable or exposed, but I'm also at the same time excited to have written it. It's called Ursa Major. I wanted a deck chair on our roof for stargazing, and though we don't have a garden, the roof is flat, and I remember rotating fluorescent star charts above my head aged 10, but they were mapped for the wrong hemisphere, so that I never learnt the constellations until over bacon sandwiches an ex-boyfriend showed me the plough in his parents' garden. And on the evening I put all the knives in the toaster and they sectioned me. I felt like I was in handcuffs. And I prefer doors now, because then I was always going for the window, pulling on the plastic handle like I couldn't work it, and roaring my lion's roar. And the police were in our bedroom, the neighbours at the door with deck chairs, and Noah's little voice below, and Orion's belt reforming in the Velux, and the WPC saying he was fine, he was having his tea. And in between my coarse screams, a rubber black bar over me in the ambulance like the Big Dipper, and the paramedics' insinuations, and the hospital guards weeing on the floor of A&E and pushing my head back into a seizure and planning to rape me, the one with the spangled arms and the one who was super tall in that room which moved like a lift. And sometimes now I feel the full moon sing like a 10p piece on my tongue, and I wheel my bike through and shrug, running through my constellations like a tarot, my finger grazing on each star, trying to make them fit. That one always leaves me out of breath. The next poem is another sort of take on that break with reality, so the unhinging or opening of the mind. Houses. They interviewed a guy on Anglia, the end wall of his terrace blown clean off like a doll's house, and all the rooms visible. Gym equipment, clothes rails, computer desk, twin divans. He wasn't rich. Tumble dryer, they said. That's how my head feels. Like there's a hole instead of a staircase in the bedroom floor, like you can peer down through the sitting room ceiling by hanging over the bed, giddy and vertiginous. Or like you might light up all the water in the pipes with potassium screaming at dog whistle that you want to go home. Some of them, some of us, kill our babies. We drive cars into walls or walk off bridges. I want to kiss those women on their foreheads and say, you're not bad, you're not bad, I see you and you're not a bad person, and fasten all the doors on their broken dolls' houses. While this next one is fictional, it definitely has a nugget of emotional truth and a lot of anti-hospital feeling, which was real. I could see it at the time in my body and mind rejecting the drugs that I was being given. Voice of the fire setter. All childhood, we played ships and lighthouses, sailing near to the fire behind its mesh, faces tinted orange by the ghost soft flames. It was Elijah's chariot we turned to over and over in our Osborne Bible, and matchsticks were a weekly treat, 10 counted into cross-legged laps like sweeties. I could smell the smoke the moment they got me on the ward. The cardamom warmth of the hearth was back in my eyes, comforting and gritty. We needed a burning, a cleansing of the hospital, like someone sterilizing surgical instruments. There were just too many of us sick. Blistered against the spark wheel, my thumb teased out a tea light flame, let it die, and called it forth again. The thought of all those branching corridors aflame from my little lighter was as giddying as an oak packed into an acorn. I'm going to read the title poem for the collection. Snow Globe. All those weeks, the summer waited for me like a snow globe. Around the time I thought I could fly, one of those weeks when I felt elated by the glitter in the floor tiles, and my heart and mouth were full of song, feet starry from the seeds and grains, the dust of noon. I was making and remaking the bed twice a day, half lifted on dry flaring storms. But he came, only once, upturned my cloistered world. The nurse said it wasn't my fault. Evening dust played in the window while I handed round parsley like Ophelia, thinking she meant the sheets. The book, Snow Globe, gives quite a lot of space to recovery poems. I think when you're a person in acute mental distress, you're not very listened to, and certainly not on an equal footing. Anyway, this one is the friendship prescription. After wandering round A&E, before falling into a grand mal seizure, I prescribed myself somebody to listen. In the absence of campfire and blankets, someone would huddle inside the tent of curtains, perched on my rickety metal bed. And though this wasn't part of the hospital offering, since then I have been listened to, held, till there's no more them but all us. A crocheted blanket around taut shoulders, lips to the baby's warm fontanelles, the white moon shifting on its anchor. And I think the next poem is really pointing to the kind of recovery spaces which are probably by necessity quite scarce in the NHS environment. So that could be contemplation, complementary therapies, perhaps poetry. And I think that in my experience, that's across physical and mental conditions. So this poem is "The NHS is no place for witchery." The NHS is no place for witchery, but to raise up a candle or sachet, the heartfelt murmur of prayer or incantation is an intuitive fumbling after wellness. I have hidden spikenard essential oil in a real glass vial up my dressing gown sleeve to anoint the bathwater with blurry dots. Tides of lavender shift beneath the waterline, where bees murmur and a censer swings its scent slow and mauve and majestic. And when my chaperone's eyes turn matte as sea gems, the long thin room is a meadow in Provence, and if I could but stay there, only stay. Is there time for one more?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, great. So I think this next and last poem, it speaks to, in a way, to poetry as a recovery tool, both in terms of finding an audience who can understand you and be sympathetic, and also the process of writing it being a kind of healing internal dialogue. Anyway, that's quite a lot in a poem, but this one is "Say that my illness were a fairy child." Say that my illness were a fairy child, and that for years I carried her unwittingly, but when the pangs came for him, she slipped out too, like a seal pup. Say I blew raspberries into her belly button, applying balms with cotton wool, cradled her in lullabies and crochet, lip traced her non-existent eyebrows, and held out my pinkies to both small fists. Well, what else could I have done? Let's say it was love, that I didn't care that my hair was dishevelled, and I wasn't prepared to be ashamed of this colicky, fey little changeling. My daughter's my daughter for all of her life. What was there to do? but embrace her. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I had the privilege of reading through those poems before today, and that one got me, the last one in particular got me just as much as it did the first time I read it. Thank you so much for sharing them, and I look forward to Snow Globe when it is published and reading all of the poems together.
Thank you.
Okay, next we welcome Fiona Hamilton. Fiona specialises in creative, expressive and reflective writing and devising projects with creative and therapeutic aims. She has extensive group and one-to-one experience of facilitating in the NHS and complementary healthcare, with community groups devising projects to raise awareness and challenge stigma with young people in schools and on experimental poetry and drama projects. She is an arts lead for the National Centre for Integrative Medicine, and at the University of Bristol teaches students who wish to complement clinical studies by exploring concepts of health and their own lives using poetry. Poetry, movement, humour, conversation and reflective writing. Fiona has published work for theatre, poetry collections, radio pieces and public art, and during the pandemic, a play for live online audiences which explored themes of mind and body and the power of music and dance. Relevant published work includes a chapter for the book Medicine, Health and the Arts, Words and Thresholds in Scriptum Creative Writing Journal, and the books Writing Roots and Writing Works. Fiona studied literature at Oxford University and is currently Director of Studies and tutor at Metanoia Institute, London. Welcome, Fiona.
Thank you very much. And I was very moved by Jenny's poems and some of the things that were said around them, such as the process of writing being a healing internal dialogue. And I guess that process of writing is something that I'm involved with other people, but also as myself, writing poetry and in other forms. So I'm going to start with a poem. I was remembering what the reticent young poet on Zoom said. Perhaps we should think that poems are in the world already, not waiting for us to let them in. As you and I were discussing lazily whether it's okay to make love while the world burns, and butterflies. You had a memory of a place called Butterfly Lane, and butterflies covering a buddleia, which I heard as Buddha, and we laughed. And I wondered what the Buddha would say about a room full of butterflies, and the line, one little room and everywhere, fluttered in. Poems are here, though not always visible, but if we're still enough, we may notice them, not by seeking them out, but by simply watching and waiting. I think when I was asked to come and contribute today, and the question of how poetry can provide a different way of understanding experiences of illness and health, I presume, and also engagement with health services, I thought about that looking and noticing, and how a poem maybe notices some of the layers, some of the contradictions, some of the richness, messiness, if you like, of the thing that we might call medicine. And I'd like to say, you know, the definition of medicine that we sometimes have that's dominant being maybe not the whole story. So maybe when we think of it, it's something to do with hospitals and a particular form of training. But for me, it's also human interactions and all the people involved in health in all sorts of ways. So the carers that have been at the forefront of care in the pandemic, and social workers and nurses and a whole range of people. In fact, probably every single one of us, and every single one of us with bodies and minds. And I think that's why this realm of study is so fascinating to me. And I came to this intersection between poetry and health or healing, partly through a confluence of different interests, but also personal experience. So I had an experience of cancer in my 30s, which really brought me into the sharp end of well, my own emotional life, I guess, and sense of mortality, but also, you know, the sort of advanced medical practices that are available for that in the West, in this country. And whilst I was enormously grateful and remain so for that treatment, I also at times felt that my own experience was being kind of squashed into a very small space, and the desire to somehow have room to say more about what was happening for me felt absolutely as important as all the other things that were helpful. And so, and poetry felt like the thing that could do that best. And I think that's because poems are able to encompass things that are contradictory, that are multi-layered, that don't make the sort of sense that some logical thinking makes, but makes different kinds of sense. And that felt like the language that I needed. And later on, a member of my family that I was caring for had a mental health condition which really brought me into another context altogether and helped me understand better what landscapes of the mind there are. I mean, some of them, they're absolutely infinite, and Jenny's poems speak to many of those dimensions. So I'm going to read a little bit from a long poem that was a kind of story in verse I wrote some years ago relating to that. And in it, a parent is caring for their child and is interacting with the health services. And there's a sense that the mental health professionals are not able to answer all the questions and don't have all the knowledge, and there are unknowns and mysteries in it for them as well. And some of them are willing to acknowledge that, and those are the ones who feel most connected with the person, with the protagonist, and others aren't, and that makes things more difficult. So this is just one short part from it. It was performed by two dancers, and the spoken words accompanied the movements. Our guides are in the dark too, for this is dancing on the edge. And who can say they understand the brain or the mind? Who can say they know where the beginning is or where the end? Who can say where mind meets body and how they dance together? This is dancing on the edge. And who can describe the movement of a thought? Is it a wave or a river? Is it fiber optic or digital? How can anyone describe the birth of a feeling? Mappers of the brain's intricate pathways are just setting out into uncharted territory with a backpack and pencil and paper in shorts and big heavy boots. I teach the poetry of medicine course to medical students, and it's an optional course for them. And it's part of an initiative in Bristol by people who are coming from the medical faculty and also the English faculty. And there's a sense that whole person care is something that they wish to bring to the students. So this is one strand of it. And in it, students get to write, they get to read, and they get a strand which is to do with connecting up poems with medical practice in various ways and in practical ways. So perhaps working with a patient in a practice with a poem, or bringing poetry into the waiting room areas, as in poems in the waiting room, which is a well-established scheme. And so these students are very much involved in, not in so much in crafting poems for an audience, but in being involved in the process of writing and seeing what it's like to express things from different perspectives, maybe to take the first person perspective on a condition that they've treated and see what it's like to enter into that. It's also a way for them perhaps to express some of their own feelings of vulnerability, and also to adopt the persona of patient, which of course we all are, as well as, you know, we may be health practitioners, but we're also patients at times in our lives. So what's it like to drop the sort of persona of somebody coping, somebody in a strong and resilient standpoint, and to express some of that vulnerability. And the messages we get back are that this is helpful in various ways, but it also is enriching, because in that expression there's so much colour and life and vitality, and so many of the nuances of what they're doing in their everyday work are able to be kind of brought out and brought into visibility and shared. So that's some of what that course is about. And I think, just to quote Foucault, who was so influential in thinking about how medical education changed after the French Revolution, and how that distance perhaps between, you know, had a doctor and patient expanded as people's tools and instruments got more refined, and people could be observing other humans in a slightly distant way. But his words bring us back to the sort of passionate nature of this realm. The body with its tensions and its burnings, the silent world of the entrails, the whole dark underside of the body lined with endless unseeing dreams. And his words there just sort of pointing to the to this huge landscape that medicine and health work in general is also concerned with. He talked about the reductive discourse of the doctor, and we might also say the reductive discourse that we share as a society, perhaps, about what we think medicine or healthcare is, and how might we expand that, and how might we think about it afresh and more truthfully, perhaps. So I'm just going to end with another poem, and it's a poem that attempts to just bring a fresh perspective to the wonderful and amazing architecture of the spine. And that's the sort of thing that we might be encouraging in our students, you know, just to look afresh and to look closely and to spend time and slow down and see what you see what you notice. Designing a backbone. Imagine whoever it was sitting down at the drawing board, sketching a few ideas for a backbone. Many antlered beasts, staircases that rotate and evaporate, butterflies with teardrop abdomens and long arms. It would have been so difficult to get it right. It had to be flexible and strong, hard, impermeable, yet springy for constant use by bipeds. Look at it now, here. It's built on 4 simple shapes: the drum, the arch, the star. Here they are, 33 interlinking calcium pieces, separated and connected with gel-filled cushions. A substance called aggrecan that absorbs water and distributes hydraulic pressure in all directions. Imagine threading multi-track communication systems down a central flexible column. Cladding has to be amazing. Think of it, a work of art, right at the center of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. I really enjoyed that poem you just read. Straight away thinking about backbone and the kind of the many different associations we have with the word backbone, and actually what we're talking about is a spine, something that, as you say, runs down the middle of all of us. Yes, so we are going to welcome our final speaker now, Dr. Ryan J. Petteway. He is an assistant professor in the OHSU PSU School of Public Health. His applied research integrates social epidemiology and community-based participatory research and youth participatory action research to examine placemaking and health, making use of information and communication technologies to democratize and enhance research and practice processes. Dr. Petteway's current scholarship engages in three general areas. Firstly, notions of place, embodiment and placemaking in community development, and the social, economic and political processes that govern the spatial distribution of health opportunities. Secondly, epistemic, procedural and distributive justice within public health knowledge production processes, e.g. considerations of power, inclusion and epistemic equity, and application of critical theory to examine dominant discourse narrative frames of health equity and pervading ethical frames of public health law and police powers. His poetry has appeared in both poetry and academic health presses. His poem, Together Untethered, was awarded an April 2020 National Poetry Month Prize and nominated for a 2021 Pushcart Prize. His poem, Latent Missing, was honoured with the 2020 Lawrence W. Green Paper of the Year Award by Health, Education and Behaviour. Welcome, Dr. Ryan Petteway.
Lovely. I would, love to invite. I'm going to spotlight our panelists and Laura, and hand over to Laura to make a first response.
Thank you. I'm going to keep it quite brief because I think probably there are going to be quite a few questions or discussion points from these fascinating talks and this wonderful poetry that we've been treated to this afternoon. First, I just wanted to make a comment on the poetry in general, in terms of how I feel that we've been treated to some great examples of why poetry is such a fantastic vehicle for helping us to understand lived experience from the voices of the people who have that experience, from the knowers, and how we can learn so much from those and honour those voices. So thank you so much for that. And I think as well what Fiona was saying about the contradictory nature of our experiences and the messiness, and how poetry can be a great tool for exploring those contradictions and those things about our lives and our emotions and our experiences that aren't straightforward and cannot be communicated logically, but still need to be made sense of. For me personally, I found the sharing of the poetry from all of the speakers today to be a wonderful reassurance that what I've chosen to do with the condition of endometriosis and with uterine pain, it is something that will suit the experiences that I want to convey. So thank you for that. Let's see where I put my notes. In terms of what Ryan was saying about poetry as praxis, touching on there, I read actually, Ryan, your poetry as praxis paper, and I really valued it because there has been some reading that I've been doing around poetic approaches to research that some of the processes didn't sit well with me because they did feel quite extractive. They seemed as though they were stating that they were about really putting lived experience central to the research process. But it did seem to be that there were the experience may sometimes have been in interview, and then the poet was acting as an editor. And I felt that there was something that wasn't quite the way I wanted to go. And I think what you were saying about poetry as praxis is makes a lot of sense. And when you talk about more poetry as method being a way of colonizing the experiences of the those with lived experience, that made a lot of sense to me, and it helped me to understand why it hadn't been sitting well. So I just kind of wanted to ask a couple of questions, really. To Ryan, I just wondered if you would possibly be able to expand a little more on poetry as praxis in a kind of in terms of approaches. If this is appropriate in terms of the work you do, if you're working with groups of people with lived experience, say of a particular condition, and you want to ensure that you are representing their experience in a way that values it and honours it, what are the kind of approaches that you would take? And then a question to Jenny and to Fiona, in fact to all of you in terms of your poetry, probably more of a craft-based question. Again, focusing on what Fiona said about how the poetry can show how multi-layered and contradictory our experiences are. I wanted to ask a little bit about how poetic form, not in terms of structures, but in terms of rhythm and pace and tone and mood, particularly in Jenny's poetry, the use of space and distance, lapses of time, that sort of thing, really enable us to help a reader to understand the complexities of the experiences that the poetry communicates. So yeah, I hope those make sense. I had so many notes. It was also fascinating. I didn't really know where to go with the questions, but yeah, so approaches to poetry as praxis, and craft questions in terms of how we manipulate the elements of form in order to make these stories, our own stories, understood.
So would people like to respond in the order that Laura was addressing you guys, which I think was Ryan, then Fiona, then Jenny? Would that work?
Sure. Yeah. So in terms of applying this this notion in practice in my work, just starting that process. And so I think I mentioned near the end when I was speaking some work with youth poetry competitions, and so that'll be the first time I've actually just tried to put this in my scholarship more formally as a scholar, as a researcher. And I think that as I think about this and as I strategize it and I plan it, I think the key thing is really honoring this idea of practice and where it's rooted in terms of lived experience, right? Critical consciousness, things that Paulo Freire talks about, right? Centering margins, things that Bell Hooks talks about, partial situated knowledge, like considering that. And I think that for me, to do poetry as praxis in public health is to really, this back and forth of like it's theory and action at the same time, right? So I think there's an internal process for the poets to go through to pull from their lived experience and their knowledge, right? To put that in there, and then speaking it out is an act, right? And from my orientation conceptually and the way that I kind of approach it, it's an act of resistance, it's an act of counter-narrative, it's an act of reclaiming, right? And I think there's power in that, right? So you're acting on the world while you're reflecting on it, right? And so I think that's kind of how I really see this for my orientation, right? And so I think going forward, for me, what that means, what that entails, is that we don't do the extractive thing anymore, right? That's not praxis. That's poetry as colonization. That's poetry as extraction. That's settler colonial orientations, white supremacist type things, where you're just taking someone's story, discounting it, and now it's yours, right? The quote that I opened up with bell hooks, right? That's the silencing, right? The epistemic violence aspect of what we do when we have used poetry and health research before. The other side of that is that if we view poetry as praxis, that means we show up with an invitation to listen to the full story, not to truncate it, not to induce someone into smothering their testimony, not to throw it into deuce and like do all these things. I think, Laura, you described it like that's not what this is. This means we solicit and we publish full poems. We don't have a sample of 15 folks that do qualitative research and focus groups, or a sample of 15 patients and have them write poems and analyze it and publish what we analyze. We have them write 15 poems and we publish those poems in their entirety with their names on it. For me, that's where this goes for me. This is no longer about this generalized knowledge and make sense of it as us because we have the credentials, right? That ritual that's done for me with poetry. That's not poetry, it's praxis. So this means that we need to change how we think about poetry and conceptualize it as a part of knowledge production, right? It makes no sense. Like the hypocrisy in our models of science and knowledge production, the fact that we think that we can listen to someone's poem and analyze it and create and turn it into knowledge as if it was acknowledged at its core, in its essence, right? The fact that we normalize that, we don't interrogate that, I mean, it's trash, right? Like there's no reason that we continue to do this, right? And so it's not to throw shade on saying, hey, like you should never use poetry in that capacity. Like I kind of want to say that, but I realize that there's probably a time and a place for that, right? But for me, that's just not what poetry should be about, right? It's not about hijacking someone else's story and rendering it in some other format, right? It's about honoring that story. And if we're going to do that, for me, that's what that would look like in practice, in terms of praxis.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and that makes a lot of sense to me. Thanks very much, Ryan.
Yeah, shall I come in? I guess quite a bit of my work is trying to create places where listening happens, and so listening where people are able to then create. So sometimes it results in an instant anthology of their work, which may not go much further than the setting that it's made in, but it might. And I think I'm really interested in poetry as a collaborative activity, and so it could be a transient one, so it might be that there are voices in the room, something collaborative is created with those voices and those people's words, and those people experience it as a live event. I'm really interested in that as a form. And then the extract I read, one of the part that was from the story in verse, talking about how do we manipulate different aspects, space, pace, tone, mood, rhythm, and so on, to make stories our own. Well, I was trying to talk about an experience of kind of being involved in mental and physical kind of experience, which was felt like embodying it was really important. So it was an absolute privilege to have two people whose work is movement, engage with the words that I'd created and make them their own. And I was able to kind of, be there, but over to them kind of thing. And then, so it was a bit like a translation activity, I guess. And so movement meant space, obviously distance between bodies was part of it. Pace was, the rate at which touch might happen or moving away. And then because there's voice as well, how the voice and the words connected in with those motifs created out of the words and then related back to the words. So and the other thing was there was an audience, but I'm interested in audiences that aren't just watching and then clapping and going away, or if that's what they want to do, but just having a conversation with the audience getting a kind of sense of this thing that you're making being also a collaborative thing, and that people's commentary about it is also part of the making. So I think those different qualities for me are also poetry, not only words on the page.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I completely agree. Those qualities, those performance qualities, and the way that we can combine poetry with other arts as well, whether they be visual arts or I've worked with poetry and soundscapes before, which has been really exciting. Jenny, I just wanted to add on to what I was saying about the question. The poem that, your first poem that you read, Ursa Major, specifically, I was so interested in, because I've seen it, but everybody else hasn't. It's a block of prose, isn't it? With very little punctuation. I think your comment at the end about being out of breath kind of shows that there's very little punctuation in it. So what I was asking about to do with form, that first poem got my mind thinking about it, and then as we moved forward there were some time lapses and changes in pace and that sort of thing throughout the poems. So I just wanted to ask specifically in reference to things like the prose poem structure and the wrong footing of that sort of structure, and how those things fed into particularly the subject that you wanted to explore in your poems.
Yeah, thank you. I think for me the form of the poems is very organic rather than deliberate. So I have this lived experience, the bolus of that experience wanted to sort of drove itself into particular shapes and particular use of formal devices. Like let me try and take an example. You talked about Ursa Major. That was originally called Ugly Verse, and I struggled with the content of it being things that I find really difficult to speak about. I don't think it could have been a poem with, you know, a rhyming poem, let's say, in it was never going to be a beautiful sonnet. It just doesn't belong in that space. And I wanted the breathlessness at some, I mean, I think these decisions are made subconsciously, but I think the breathlessness, the lack of punctuation, the many ands are important for conveying a mess of experience that I was having at that time. And to me, visually on a page, I can hold it up actually. It's a block of prose. It's not a square block of prose on Blur, so nobody's going to be able to see anything at all. It is a big rectangle of prose, which is exactly the same down the left and right hand sides. And to me, that's quite an unpoetic poem, which suited the material. Whereas, again, really subconsciously, when I was writing something like the last one that I read, say that my illness were a fairy child, there's it's much more composed. It comes from a time of being ready to relate to the experiences and own them and soften towards them. And I think you can feel that in the, I've forgotten all my words, in the trochaic or whatever it is, sort of rhythm that there is picking up towards the end of it. So yeah, I think the meter is kind of showing some a more confident position for the speaker there than there is earlier on in the poems that I read. But for me, all of those, yeah, all those decisions, I don't know, just they don't happen consciously, because I'm not somebody who's very adept with formal poetry. I have written in that way, but I'm not at home in that, in the musicality of poems, more with metaphor and with imagery. And so it works best for me if I allow myself to be very natural and write what the process needs me to write. Yeah, I think I'll stop there actually.
Thank you. Do we open up to some other questions now?
Yeah, I was going to say that if people have got questions they want to raise, please put up the little yellow hand and I'll bring you in. If you want something that's read out, put it in the chat. There's a few things in the chat already which I'll read out now. I'll try and go quite quickly because we haven't got that much time. While I'm doing this though, I just thought that almost certainly, not almost certainly, people on this seminar are going to want to know where they can find more of your poems. So while I'm reading through the chat, if people would, if the three of you wouldn't mind, if there, I know Ryan's got a very well-developed website with some of his work on there. So if you would share that in the chat as well, I think that's going to be something that people are going to be really excited to follow up as well. I mean, I know they can Google, but so there's a load of lovely comments. I'm not going to read out the purely lovely comments. I'm just going to go for the questions or the points. Lucy has, during Ryan's talk, said that it reminds her of this piece by Anthony Ryan Hatch called "The Data Will Not Save Us," and she's put a link in there too. Sam has commented that this was a really interesting poem from an ex-nurse perspective, reminding us to look at person and patient in context. There's a question down here from Rachel, I think. Rachel, yeah. I don't know, but Rachel, if you want to jump in or if you want me to read your question out.
You can read it.
Is poetry, and I think it's to all of the panel, is poetry evidence, and does it tell us what action to take? Or could it, if we did poetry as practice? So love to hear, maybe if we keep the kind of order that we had last time, and go around and hear what responses the panel have to that. So is poetry evidence, and does it tell us what action to take? Or could it, if we did poetry as practice?
Yeah, poetry is certainly evidence. You know, actually, the version of the slides I gave is titled, "If you can read this, I am evidence," from a quote from Alexis Pauline Gumbs, a poet, science fiction writer. Yeah, I think that the idea of poetry as practice is just that, is that we can tell our own stories. Patients can tell their own stories. Community residents can tell their own stories. And, you know, what makes the difference if we have an N of 1,000 or if we have an N of 1? Each one of those N's in our studies is a data point. A poem is a data point. A poem is evidence. Like, why do we feel the compulsion that we have to like aggregate across so many stories to find the common denominator, when on the principles of intersectionality, that defies, there are many ways to defeat the purpose of actually trying to understand things on a deep level, right? If we want to generalize, then yes, there's a certain time frame when we do these, you know, clinical control trials and, you know, very empirical quantitative things, right? But a lot of what we do in health and public health especially is social science, and it's inherently political. And there's power that we're just leaving on the table by insisting on erasing the full humanity of people that we work with and trying to compile them across 1,000 people in the sample, right? Each poem is evidence. And I think if we treat it that way, we might be able to actually move some things within our discourse in academic space, but also in our community spaces when it comes time to social action and moving people affectually, not just cognitively.
Yeah, I think poems are evidence. In order for the evidence to really kind of reach, it has to be heard, and it's sometimes there aren't, you know, pushing aside academic structures or familiar ones and creating different ones is important. Otherwise there won't be enough of those spaces to listen differently. It's slow and things are quite embedded, and and where else can those spaces be, not just in academia, and just thinking about where else they can be in, you know, in the street, in the library, in the home, in every venue. So poetry isn't kind of sort of harbored away into enclosures, if you see what I mean. And can it tell us how to act? Well, I think if we listen deeply enough, then poetry moves us, and then we will be moved to action in whatever way. And action doesn't have to mean doing. It can mean thinking differently. It can mean feeling differently, behaving differently, understanding differently, relating differently, or just noticing what we didn't notice before, because we've actually opened up a space to notice, you know, what was previously overlooked. So yeah, definitely it can be, but and it's hard to, yeah, we all know it's hard to, for poetry to have its many spaces, the spaces that it needs. Maybe it's increasingly hard, I don't know, but yeah.
Shall I come straight in? I think that I want to say poetry isn't evidence. It can be used as evidence, but poetry is poetry. Poetry is an artistic form, and it's not, it doesn't generate itself with the view in mind of being evidence, or being, to me, that's a secondary use by research, by healthcare, by any other structure within our society, which is absolutely fine. And of course, poetry can be evidence, but I don't think it is primarily so. I think primarily it is its own genre of object, which is poetry. And it's about, for me, it's about, well, yeah, I suppose the kind of poetry I write is about subjectivity, it's like the interiority of an experience. And so the question was, does it tell us what action to take? I think it can. I think if poetry is able to generate empathy, then that empathy, as Fiona was saying, might result in somebody relating a little differently, or taking a very big, performative action. So yes, I do think it can lead to action. I'm just not sure that it is primarily, well, is evidence in a primary way. I think it is poetry. It maybe gets used as evidence.
Yeah, I suppose it begs the question of evidence and what we mean by that, and how that's sort of situated in various fields of study and discourse. So the work that I do with creative writing, for example, it comes up against the kind of evidence-based idea all the time. And how do you kind of bring any evidence to show that this is worth doing? And it's not easy, because you might be speaking a different language from the people who want to know that is worthwhile.
I suppose it's also a question of evidence of what, right? I mean, when someone, I think that runs through all three of your talks and the poetry that you read, that there's a testimony that might be evidence of a particular life, or a political position, or a historical position, or a position in the patient healthcare context, and that's a testimony of something particular, and then that gets transformed, sometimes stolen, essentially repurposed or colonized to become evidence of some other thing. That was really powerful with Ryan's graph as well, the dark red spots on the graph. I'm very conscious of the time. I'm wondering if we could, I know that Ryan dropped a poem at the last minute, and Jenny also did. I don't know if Fiona did, but I wonder if, obviously people need to go, then go, but I wonder if maybe a closing poem from each of our contributors, if they would like to do that, would be just a really wonderful way to end what was just a fantastic, mind-blowing and beautiful seminar. Where beautiful is not a word I get to use very often, but it was beautiful and moving as well as really thoughtful.